Let's go ahead and start. Good evening, everyone. My name is Viswanath. I'm one of the co-directors of the Lee Sheung Center for Health and Happiness at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. My other co-director, whose idea this is Dr. Lara Kubsonsky, who is also on this call today. It is my pleasure to welcome you to a panel discussion of the documentary, The Social Dilemma, that we hosted this afternoon. The mission of the Lee Center is to build a rigorous and interdisciplinary science of positive health and well-being, and translate that science to influence policy and practice. We hope to achieve a transformation from deficit-based thinking to an understanding of well-being in a broader sense, with a focus on health assets and resources. Like the World Health Organization, the center understands health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. At our center, we have been particularly interested in getting a more comprehensive understanding of the role of social media in population health, and particularly for youth. While there is quite a bit of research suggesting that it can harm health, other work suggests that we should be more nuanced about whether and when it affects health, and that it may also be a tool we could leverage to improve health. So a public health agenda for the research on social media is still in development, I would say infancy. So it's an important time to start that conversation and contribute to that body of knowledge. The Social Dilemma is a 2020 Netflix docudrama. I think it was released about 4 or 5 months ago, directed by Jeff Orlovsky and written by Orlovsky, Davis Coombe, and Vicky Curtis. The film features interviews with many former employees, executives, and other professionals from tech companies and social media platforms, such as Facebook, Google, Twitter, and Apple. It explores the rise of social media and its adverse effects on society, including its impact on mental health. So today's program will focus on the relationships between health, social media, and psychological well-being through the lens of the themes that were raised in the documentary. So we will attempt to explore the questions of how social media are or is affecting our health and well-being, and can they be used for good. I would like to acknowledge before we begin and thank the Lee family for their generous donation and funding to the important work on health and well-being at the Lee Center for Health and Happiness, for their continued interest in the center's work, and for their commitment to global happiness and its relation to health. And before I introduce my panelists, who will each present some opening remarks, I wonder if Lara is here. I would at least want to introduce Dr. Lara Kubsonsky, was Center's co-director. And Lara, do you want to say anything? This is Laura's idea, actually. She has been generous and sitting behind the scenes, but she has been pushing this idea. So Lara, do you want to say a few words? No? You are on mute.
Okay, sorry, I was trying to unmute myself and it kept telling me that the host wouldn't let me talk. So I was like, maybe I don't need to say anything. Well, it's great to see so many folks here. Thank you all for coming. And we're just delighted to have this discussion. It feels like a very timely moment for thinking about this issue. I saw The Social Dilemma a month or so ago, and I was really struck by the important issues that it raised. I was frustrated with some of the topics it didn't really cover as well as I wanted it to, and I thought it would be really interesting to have a discussion about, well, where do we go from here, recognizing that, you know, social media is here to stay, and you know, that we want to recognize both what's potentially harmful about it, but also maybe what are the ways that we can leverage social media for better health, or for, you know, a better civil society, if we could think about that. So we're delighted to have folks here. I think today is really meant to be a discussion, a conversation. We've got our panelists who will give some, you know, opening ideas and remarks to share how they think about some of these issues. And then we're going to open it up for discussion. We'll be happy to have comments. And I think the plan is for people to submit questions into the chat box, and then Vish is going to moderate for us. So, you know, I hope this will be really a thoughtful and provocative discussion. I don't know that we have all the answers, but we certainly have a lot of questions, and that, you know, we'll start the journey on thinking about where do we go with some of these really, you know, important issues and questions. So great to have everyone here, and thrilled that our panelists are willing to join us and share their expertise as well.
Thank you, Lara. Appreciate it. Thanks so much. I want to introduce the panelists, and it couldn't be more precise given what happened last week. And it's so tempting, given what happened last week, to think only on the negative side. But we have a very distinguished group of panelists who have actually been doing work on both the functions and dysfunctions of social media. So we will, the first, so as Lara said, the panelists will make remarks for about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll let the panelists speak, all the panelists present, and then we will start with the Q&A. So please post the questions in the chat room, and Jamie and Chuno will feed those questions to me, and I can ask them. And before I introduce the panelists, I also want to thank Jamie and Melia, who have been doing a lot of work behind the scenes again, and for pulling this off. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Stephanie Child, who will be the first speaker today. She just joined the Social and Behavioral Sciences Department at Harvard Chan as an assistant professor. Dr. Child recently completed her postdoctoral fellowship at Berkeley Population Center and the University of California, San Francisco's Nurture Center. Her research examines through a social determinants and a life course framework, changes in social networks as adults age, and the implications for health-related behaviors and chronic disease outcomes, with a focus on race and socioeconomically based disparities. Stephanie has also worked at Facebook, so she has this unique advantage of both doing work on social media and social networks outside the social media. Next will be Dr. Jeffrey Hall, a professor of communication studies at University of Kansas. He's a past chair of Human Communication and Technology Division of the National Communication Association and the founder and editor of Human Communication and Technology. He was awarded the Early Career Award from the Interpersonal Communication Division of the National Communication Association in 2015. He earned his doctorate from the Annenberg School for Communications at the University of Southern California, as we say, Annenberg West, and is the author of a number of articles and book chapters on social technologies and social media, including a recent book. And then Jeff will be followed by Dr. Emily Weinstein, a research fellow at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her research focuses on investigating and analyzing how social technologies shape the lives of kids and teens. Dr. Weinstein has published extensively in a variety of journals, including New Media and Society, Computers in Human Behavior, Journal of Adolescent Research, and International Journal of Communications. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at Project Zero, at a research center at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She's also very active in the world of practice, so outside her academic research. Emily collaborates with Common Sense Media on the development of free programs and resources related to digital citizenship. And she works regularly with teens, families, and schools. So we are very lucky to have this group of panelists today. So we will start off with Dr. Child, and then followed by Dr. Hall, and then Dr. Weinstein. So Stephanie, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Vish, and thank you, Laura, for putting this all together. Again, I think it's really fantastic. And as you mentioned, timely opportunity. I'm sure it's been a while since a lot of us have viewed the film. There were, several people that viewed it today, including myself, with the all new, kind of rage from viewing the video. But I do want to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen and go through a couple of slides to kind of talk about, I think, things that the film hopefully jog your memory a little bit about what the film does and does not do. So hopefully you can see this here. I'm going to be great. Can you see not my presenter view, but do you see? Yep, great. Okay. So my name is Stephanie. As Vish mentioned, I am predominantly interested in social networks and health. And as a lot of our relationships are moving from offline to online, my work is inherently kind of moving in the direction of examining social media. So just to give you kind of a quick background, let me see, there we go. So I am predominantly in networks and health, but just to kind of give you an idea of what my full background looks like, I did get a degree in psychology and as an undergrad with a focus on human behavior. And certainly there's a lot of that goes on in the video. They talk about reinforcement schedules. And so I think anyone who has a degree in psychology is familiar with those. I then went on to get a graduate degrees in health promotion, where I specifically focused on health behaviors, so thinking about things like physical activity and diet. In studying those, I realized that a lot of our health behaviors are rooted in social contexts. And so I then went on to do a postdoc with Claude Fisher at UC Berkeley, where I specifically focused on social, or what we call personal networks. And I can explain a little bit more about those. And then, of course, as any Bay Area resident will tell you, it's hard not to get sucked into working at a tech company. And so I did some consulting work with Facebook. I was there for almost a year between 2018 and 2019, so fairly recently. And I worked on a team called the Foundational Wellbeing Team, which is about a dozen researchers with similar backgrounds as mine, who are very interested in the well-being of their users. Okay. So I kind of just want to give you three main thoughts of kind of what I thought about the video and kind of hopefully steer or guide the way that we might converse about this now this evening. So first of all, I just want to mention, and I think the video did a somewhat good job of this, but just to remind you that popular culture has always kind of lamented new technology, especially when it has to do with our social interactions and how we communicate with and other human beings. And so I'll kind of highlight some work that, was done on the telephone. The internet first came about, right? We've been very cautious about these new technologies. The same is true for social media, and we are actively living through, this phase where we're trying to figure out what's going on, right? And so we don't have all the answers yet. Is it possible that we will move on from this phase and, with few consequences? Not likely, but might we look back on this phase and realize, that we were more worried about it than we should have been? I'm not sure. So just to contextualize, a lot of my work, as I mentioned, is in offline relationships, personal networks, so family and friends, our coworkers, our neighbors. And there's a tremendous amount of research that suggests that networks are extremely important for both physical and mental well-being. But there's also a lot of research that's starting to come out that suggests that even offline relationships have potentially harmful consequences consequences, both for physical health, in terms of things like peer pressure for smoking, drinking, but also mental health as well. And so it's not that we should entirely imagine that online relationships and networks are not going to be devoid of any problems. So I think, the third takeaway is that we should set kind of realistic goals and expectations of what we want social media to be going forward, given the sense that it's, I think as Laura mentioned, it's not going anywhere, right? It's here to stay. And so let's think about it from a standpoint of how can we make it better. I keep doing that, sorry. Okay, so just kind of a historical context of new media. I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this. And so again, pundits of new technology, such as the telephone, the television, internet, and texting, have always kind of said similar things, right? They basically lament that it's leading to declines in our social relationships. And this is truly kind of the bedrock of human social interaction, right? Is this ability to communicate with one another, to trust other individuals, to pass information. And so anytime there's kind of a new technology that changes the way that we communicate with other humans, there's a lot of caution around that. People have always said that new technology is overly complicated, that it accelerates the pace of life, and there's kind of this erosion of social fabric. And so I kind of want to talk about those a little bit more. So just quickly, if you haven't read this book, I'll say I worked with Claude Fisher for 4 years. He did not force me to place an advertisement for his book in here, but if you haven't read it, it is a fantastic look at kind of how the telephone evolved over a course of about 50 years, truly until it kind of became mainstream. And on the left, you can kind of see where some of the discourse around it was that it demanded kind of these instant reactions, right? You were calling individuals, you were expected to receive an instantaneous, reaction or response, right? So there's this decline in thinking about how you were going to respond to someone. That's certainly true in social media as well, right? For the first time, we kind of see this construct of multitasking, right? Which we're all very familiar with now. There's this idea that there's going to be gossip, right? So that might be kind of the new age or modern day misinformation or kind of disinformation. This was certainly true with the telephone as well. And also this idea of etiquette, right? So hello was kind of seen as this really strange way to greet people over the phone. And so it took several decades for us to kind of develop a social etiquette on how to use the telephone. I think all of those things are certainly true for the internet and for social media. And as I mentioned, this played out over 40 or 50 years for the telephone. I think the same thing is going to be true for the internet and then also for social media. And we are at the very early stages of that. Fast forward to 2000s, you have this really interesting and fantastic book by Robert Putnam, who is basically also kind of lamenting online or internet relationships. And again, it's kind of this decline in social capital, or what we also refer to as trust. And so he kind of talks about this idea that the internet is going to replace all of our face-to-face interactions. They're going to be more shallow. And so I think, again, I just kind of want to wrap up by saying that we have to think about social media as this new form of technology and kind of contextualize it there. So I'm just going to move forward in the interest of time. So where social media, though, may differ, and I think the video got at some of these, is the availability of information, right? At any particular time or day, you can find someone who is going to agree with you. And so while we're also dealing with new forms of social media, we're also kind of dealing with this transition of how we get our information. And it used to be that we were only getting information from people that we trusted. And now we can get information that we trust simply because it aligns with our previous, kind of preconceived notions, right? There's also the acceleration of information. So we saw this again with the telephone. We were worried about gossip. gossip, right? The same is true for social media. We are very concerned with how quickly information and misinformation is being spread, and the ability to kind of control information. You can also argue there are some very highly addictive features of social media. However, again, I would argue that a lot of folks said the same things about new forms of technology, the telephone, and the video also talks about kind of these reinforcement schedules, kind of like so the intermittent schedule is similar to gambling, and that is certainly true for social media. And I think those are kind of some of the main issues that I think we are going to have to really focus on moving forward. Okay. Let me go back if I can. So my work is mostly around personal networks and health. Again, as I mentioned, there are several studies that have found very, very strong correlations between networks and a variety of both health behaviors and health outcomes. I'm personally very interested in personal network characteristics in cardiovascular disease, right? So those are wildly distal kind of, predictors and outcomes, but certainly there are a lot of studies that show these relationships. And the large body of literature has suggested that by and far networks are positive for health. Larger networks are better, more diverse networks are better. They provide material resources, information, social support, tons and tons of benefits. However, I would say in the last about 20 years or so, we've also started to realize that even offline and personal relationships that we have with our friends and family can carry very negative consequences as well. And actually, I believe about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had Dr. Cheryl Woods come and present, and she presented some of her work where she's talked about kind of a social contagion where there can be kind of this transmission of depression or stress from our friends. And so the ways that we're feeling even are kind of socially contagious. And that certainly can be true for both online and offline relationships. Okay. So this is a really interesting kind of image from an article in The Economist that came out on data from 2017. I think it was written up in 2018 or 2019. But I really wanted to draw your attention to this because I think we constantly talk about the negative aspects of social media for health. And certainly, as you can see on kind of the top half of this table, there are a lot of issues, right? It's interfering with sleep, and there's this fear of missing out. And certainly I think that those get into kind of some of the addictive patterns, but there's also things like bullying or body image, things that go along with kind of these social comparison issues that are happening online. However, on the bottom half of the table, we see tremendous for lots of things, including, if we're interested in public health, right? Access to health advice kind of is in that middle range. Certainly at the more bottom edges of the table, we see things like emotional support and self-identity. So I think it's good to keep in mind that there are very positive things that can come out of social media. It's just how do we amplify those things and how do we kind of mitigate some of the bad things. So that's, again, I think where we really need to kind of focus our attention. And I think this graph is a good, kind of helps us to kind of focus our efforts. Okay, briefly, I just also wanted to talk about some work that I did at Facebook, and that we were specifically interested again in this very kind of causal relationship between social media use and mental health. And I was specifically looking at loneliness, which is of course only one facet of mental health. But truly we're very interested in, what comes first. And unfortunately at that time, we were not using longitudinal data. So we were trying to assess this with cross-sectional data. But what we were able to kind of parse out is that individuals who were feeling more lonely felt like they resorted to using social media, and in particular Facebook, when they were feeling lonely, right? And so it's this, you know, it's this easy app on your phone. You're at home and you're not feeling well, or you're bored, and you just happen to get on your phone, and an hour goes by, and you may or may not be feeling worse, right? And so we asked users a series of questions, and a lot of this was done through survey work, but also some of it was done in real time, right? So we're asking people to get on the app, let's observe your behavior, tell us how you're feeling while you're using the app. And so we do notice that individuals who are feeling lonely will use the app for longer periods of time, but the results are mixed in terms of what happens when they get there. And actually, some folks do report feeling better. They certainly can log on and see pictures of their friends. They can connect with their family members. And there's another half of folks who say that they feel worse. And so it comes down to some very specific things like user behavior. What we define as active versus passive use is certainly a topic, as well as kind of user demographics as well. And so, for example, sexual and gender minorities were more likely to say that if they were feeling lonely and they got on the app, they were more likely to feel worse. And so, I think that there can be very specific and targeted ways that we get folks to kind of limit or monitor their time, but also monitor and kind of think a bit more about their behavior once they're on the platform itself. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that moving forward. So again, just some suggestions. I think the whole goal of tonight is really not to kind of poke all the holes in social media that we can, because certainly we can do that for a long time, but how do we truly think about how do we move forward, and what are the best steps forward from a public health standpoint. So again, just another quick graph from The Economist. And if I were to show you this graph and the suggestion that you might make is, let's just reduce everyone's time on these apps, right? Certainly this graph shows that the more time you spend on a specific app, the more likely you are to be what's considered a sad user, right? But again, all of these are cross-sectional parses of data. And it's truly that we haven't, and I think Jeff will talk about this a little later, is that we don't have a lot of causal data to really kind of look at what the effects of getting off an app are, or reducing your time on an app are. So I think that's just one very limited aspect of it, right? Some other ideas that I have, and I'd love to hear more thoughts, and we'll talk about this more, is redesigning with health in mind. And this was something that they started to talk about, but very briefly at the end. And so some of this is actually already happening, where Facebook especially has shifted away from a growth mindset to more of an engagement mindset. They know that the longer you spend on their app is not necessarily better. So they have shifted away from the total amount of time. But I will let you know that one of their goals now is to get you on the app every day, right? So it doesn't matter how long you spend, as long as you log in every day. So the metrics are changing. The ways like that they mentioned in the video, the ways that they're dialing in are certainly already changing. Other ways is to create diversity in both their stakeholders, the people who are designing these apps, and also their users, right? And certainly they are doing that. We might talk about government regulation, and also trust in companies, their own ability to kind of oversee their own monitorization of that regulation, right? Do we trust that they're going to make these changes? I will let you know that Facebook also already has a fairly strong program for monitoring users who mention kind of suicidal ideation, and they will reach out to those folks and provide them with resources. So there is already monitorization going on from a public health standpoint, and those folks are receiving the resources that they need, hopefully, to improve their outcomes. And then also I think education is a big tool, right? Teaching not only young folks, but also older adults about how to use platforms, I think is truly the way forward, and tailoring our goals specifically, for specific age groups. And with that, I'm much over time, so I'm going to end it. And I look forward to hearing all of your questions and feedback. So thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephanie. You really set the table, so to speak. It was very helpful. I particularly liked that you also brought in the idea of offline or social networks. I think that's very critical for this. So just to remind people, please put your questions in the chat. We are monitoring them, and we will start asking the questions at the end of all three talks. Now I invite Dr. Hall to talk about his work.
Thank you. So I want to start by saying thanks to Harvard University for the invitation, and to the T.H. Chan School of Public Health for the invitation to speak to you today. I'll start with saying I am a parent myself. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge all the parents who are joining us today. Thank you for being here. I know that finding time to attend these panels is really, really hard. So I appreciate your time. My own kids, Graham and Rowan, are 10 and 7. And so we have many battles here in our home about media use. However, the challenges of adolescent are still ahead of us. So I share the concerns of all the parents here today about media, but I also want to know more about what the future of my own family might look like. So I'm going to try to be as brief as possible so we can get to your questions. My research is focused on really the spillover and the influence of offline and online forms of communication. So how do they influence one another? How do people develop and maintain relationships that are both in person or through media? I just finished writing a book called Relating Through Technology, and in it, I review the research on texting, Facebook, and other forms of social media, mediated social interactions like through the phone or video chat, and of course, face-to-face interactions. And I take all of this to study something that I call the social biome. I want to look at how the nature and pattern of social interaction in our life is related to our social health and our well-being. So the idea is the patterns of our behaviors, both the content of what we talk about, the who, and the modalities in which that we relate to one another play a role in kind of developing our fabric of our social biome. The movie, The Social Dilemma, the film, I have some concerns, but I gather we may talk about those later. So I'm gonna just give you two big takeaways. The first thing is, although I do not agree that big technology firms control us like a puppet master as portrayed in the film, I do agree that the goal of technology companies is for people to spend time on their platforms, especially in competition with the other technology companies, and as Dr. Child just alluded to. However, my bigger concern with the film is that it strips away the social part of social media. The who are you communicating with? So to ask the question of whether social media is good or bad sort of misses the point. And it's not a question of either or. And like many things, it's a both and. So let's start with what the research really tells us. Is social media good for you? And this is the answer that I give anybody who ever asked me, is social media good for people? And I want to share 3 research findings. The first is there's really poor evidence that social media causes negative outcomes. However, there's much better evidence that people turn to social media when they are not well, physiologically, emotionally, or socially. Second, a Stanford study, which summarized all the available evidence, found that any small negative effects are probably balanced out by small positive effects. And then finally, an Oxford study of 350,000 adolescents that tried to identify the best predictors of adolescent well-being, it found that whether or not adolescents eat potatoes is a better predictor of their well-being than the amount of time that they use social media. So what does that mean? For most of the time, for most adolescents and young adults, social media is a net zero. It is neither good nor it is bad. So it's not the cause of misery, but it's also not a particularly great use of your time. So we have to ask ourselves, what else would they be doing with that time if they weren't on social media? So in my own research, I found that when adults are off social media for weeks at a time, they don't spend that time writing the next great American novel or finally learning to play the jazz flute they've always wanted to. Instead, they fill that time browsing the internet, watching other programs, and also doing things they were avoiding, like working and cleaning and cooking and doing other chores. So similarly, we have to acknowledge that social media time is competing with other media, TV, movie, games, internet use, and all of that stuff that kept my generation and generations before me pretty well occupied. So it's critical to understand that social media does not exist as a vacuum. It depends on what else teens are able to do with their time and what they have available to them at the time. So meaning what is available to them in media choice, or what they're allowed to do at their own home and their own environments. So what is a good use of time? It's something we might want to ask. I often say that there are very few better uses of your time than building good relationships with friends and family. It tends to be the most valuable, sustaining, nourishing, and meaningful things that we can do with our entire life. It doesn't mean that every relationship is a good relationship. It doesn't mean there aren't struggles, but it means that the time that we spend in those things, research suggests, is something that's really meaningful in our lives. Close relationships are particularly important, and they're really important for almost all the most important things in life: longevity, satisfaction with life, basically a sense of well-being. During that critical period between 15 and 25, this is basically adolescence to young adulthood, it is a decade of time you have to build friendships. Friendships are really important for creating your identity, figuring out where you're going to go in your life, creating a nourishing kind of social environment for you to grow and become yourself. So all in all, I tend to think that teens hanging out with each other is actually a really good thing for them to be doing. But what does that mean for social media? It means that when people use social media for the sake of sustaining, building, and making quality relationships, it's probably also a really pretty good use of their time. So when we want to understand the good and the bad parts of social media, we want to look through a relational lens. We want to talk about who we communicate with, for what purposes, using what forms of communication and with what content. So consider some evidence that why this might be so important to think from a relational perspective about this. The first is one of the more strong kind of hypotheses about how we think about all the different modality usage is something that's called the rich get richer hypothesis. And it essentially suggests that people who are socially skilled with good relationships tend to have more friends, more time on social media, more time in face-to-face relationships too. So they direct their time towards things that are social and rewarding of their sense of being a social person. And that also means that people who are not socially skilled, who don't have a lot of friends, who don't have a great social relationship with one another, also struggle to be able to build those things. So media reflects what's going on in their day-to-day lives. The other thing that I might mention is also something that Dr. Child mentioned. Directly communicating with friends, something that used to be called texting and now is being swallowed by the different social media platforms, tends to be a better use of your time than scrolling or browsing. Why? From my point of view, it's social interaction with people typically who matter. We don't usually have a text network of people who we talk to that usually exceeds 12 individuals. These tend to be 12 people who are pretty important to us. So what's going on here is that we actually find that offline life and online life are really strongly associated with one another. But does that mean it's all good? No. If you ask adolescents, they often say that social media is both the best and the worst. Why? Because adolescents get pulled into digital drama and conflict through their mobile device. Because adolescents feel overwhelmed with the amount of messages, notifications, platforms, and posts to attend to. They feel they must be accessible to people from waking up in the morning to falling asleep at night. And they often don't know how to regulate their use of media in general. They haven't built those tools at exactly the point of their lives where they so badly want to communicate with their peers. So it's a very difficult time for them to navigate the pressures of social media. So they need to develop healthy practices that promote social well-being, which is something much more easily said than done. What do I recommend? Basically, recognize that individuals have control. You have control over your devices and platforms, from disabling notifications to gray screens to screen time, to unsubscribing or getting out of group text exchanges, to turning off the dreaded read receipt options. There are lots of things that individuals can do to actually change their device that allows them to be free of the obligations of it. Second, steer towards direct, meaningful, fun, personalized communication. This means use social media in the way towards the few and towards the important, not towards the many and for the sake of performance. And be here now is my last piece of advice. Stay focused on the most important people in the here and now, both in person and when they're away from us. So I hope I can answer all the questions you might have. I'm navigating it myself as a parent, and I know we all want to try to help adolescents build the most healthy practices they can. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. That's great. Thanks so much. So again, please put the questions in the chat box, and we will come back and answer some of those questions. Now we will go to Dr. Emily Weinstein.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. I'm Emily Weinstein. I'm a researcher at Harvard Project Zero, and my colleague Carrie James and I run the Digital Dilemmas Project, which focuses on really trying to understand the dilemmas teens are facing in their everyday digital lives, how they think about and navigate some of the tensions that we're talking about and that you've already heard about, and the ways that practical interventions can make a real difference. So I watched The Social Dilemma as someone who's been studying teens and technology for a decade. And from that perspective, the film really has me thinking about two ideas that I want to share with you this evening. The first is something that feels missing from the story. And the second is about steps and interventions we can take right now to start reclaiming agency in ways that support well-being. So first, what was missing? There's a universality to human experience that is core to the film's message about the ways technology is exploiting biological imperatives and capitalizing on human nature. And at the same time, perhaps one of the most important findings from research about media effects, including social media and impacts on mental health, is that people are differentially susceptible. So one way that differential susceptibility is explained uses the metaphor of orchids and dandelions. Orchids are very sensitive to stimuli and environmental conditions, while dandelions are much less sensitive. They can weather a range of environments and still grow and thrive. And the point here isn't to minimize the importance of factors in the environment, or in this case, to minimize the digital tools that are designed in potentially manipulative ways. But differential susceptibility reminds us to pay attention to the ways people differ in their vulnerabilities to these digital features and tools. And variation is really proving to be a key part of the story as researchers study experiences with social media. Because as Dr. Hall mentioned, our technology use doesn't happen in a vacuum. The people who we are offline, the struggles we have, the contexts we live in, the ways that we experience both privilege and also inequities, these all profoundly shape the experiences that we're having behind the screen. There's a lot to say about each of these pieces, but I wanted to zero in on one example related specifically to well-being. So researchers now know that social comparison is a super relevant variable if we want to understand when and why time on social media is associated with declines in emotional well-being. This means that it's worth really paying attention to social media use that sparks thoughts like everyone is happier than me, or all these people seem like they're so much more successful or attractive than I am. Importantly, social comparison isn't some uniform experience that we all do to the same extent in response to the same kinds of content. There is a dispositional nature to it, so some of us are more inclined to compare and despair than others. And online, we also interact with different content, so this adds another important source of variation. If you imagine one person who's inclined toward comparison, who follows a number of influencers, and the content she looks at is constantly activating her feelings of insecurity. And then there's another person who is similarly inclined toward comparison, but she decides to unfollow the accounts that make her feel insecure and replace them with more content related to her passion for climate science, let's just say. So even though these two people share a tendency toward comparison, and even if they spend exactly the same amount of time on social media, they're now having meaningfully different experiences. Algorithms are unequivocally designed, and in fact shaping what we see and when we see it. But we can push companies to add design features like mute buttons and unfollow options that make it easier for us as users to exercise more agency and control. We can also make active choices that exercise some curatorial control, as in that example, so unfollowing or unsubscribing from certain kinds of content. And data suggests that these kinds of changes really can make a difference. When it comes to differential susceptibility, development is also a relevant consideration. So across the lifespan, there are times, and adolescence is one of them, when developmental drives and changes make us more or less vulnerable in different ways. So adolescents, for example, are primed for more social comparison to their peers. And as Dr. Hall mentioned, they are still actually developing the neural architecture that supports self-regulation. One of the people who was interviewed in The Social Dilemma points out that these technologies weren't designed by child psychologists. And another describes realizing that the tech features like the like button were being used in ways that the designers have never imagined. I really can't even tell you what it's like to listen to this as someone whose daily life is centered around exploring the ways that seemingly benign social media features are actually used by teens. For example, Snapchat added a feature called Streaks that some of you may be familiar with. Streaks essentially gamify daily communication. So the feature is a little number next to someone's name that tells you how many days of consecutive reciprocal communication you've had with that person. It's not even publicly viewable, and maybe the designers just thought that it would encourage daily use of the app without any major downsides. Like Dr. Child mentioned, one of the goals is to get you to log in every day, and this feature definitely checks that box. But in practice, for some teens, streaks have become burdensome and have given them a real sense of social obligation. So a streak can be seen as validation of a relationship. If we have a long streak, it means that we've been friends for a long time, or that's an important relationship. And because peer relationships are central to core tasks of adolescence, like connection and identity development, the impulse to protect them is a really strong one. So in teen culture, reciprocating streaks can now be considered basic politeness, and dropping a streak can be seen as a social jab. I've interviewed teens who had friends managing dozens of streaks for them while they were on vacation, or even while they were in psychiatric inpatient care, because they were so stressed about what it would mean to instead let the streak end. Teens aren't monolithic though, and for every experience like this, variability is a key part of the story. And that's why differential susceptibility as a principle is so worth bearing in mind. Attending to differences also sets the stage for effective intervention. So let's shift gears to steps and interventions that we can take right now. I want to share a few things that I learned over the last year as our team worked to create a practical resource teachers could use to help students, particularly middle and high schoolers, build agency toward healthy digital habits. So as you heard earlier, our team has for some time worked closely with Common Sense Education, which is a leading nonprofit organization that provides one of the most widely used digital citizenship curriculum and lessons for K-12 schools. And we've been working with them on creating a new tool specifically related to digital habits. We knew when we started this process of trying to develop a tool that we wanted an approach that would fuel classroom conversations that went beyond screen time. Screen time is a relevant variable for sure, but when we start and end conversations there, we overlook the reality that an hour spent browsing extremist propaganda just isn't the same as an hour chatting with cousins who live far away. As one team recently put it, just because we're on a device doesn't mean we're wasting our time. We started with a few other data-driven assumptions too. Things like conversations about digital habits don't have to be an adults versus teens battle. Teens don't want to feel powerless over technology. They do want to have interests, successes, and meaningful relationships with others. And they can already identify some of the ways that technology undercuts these goals in their everyday lives. So after developing and iterating an approach built with these considerations in mind, and then field testing it in different classrooms and contexts, we found that there are a few key ingredients that seem to make for a powerful learning experience around digital habits. Our protocol starts by asking teens to reflect on all of their digital habits, good and bad. They brainstorm as many things as they can think of. And the reason for this is that habits become invisible forces that shape our behavior until we pause to actively take stock of them. So this reflection is about developing a kind of mindfulness around technology use. What do I do without even realizing it? When do I reach for my phone? What apps am I using and when? We also ask them to identify for each of these habits, how the habit makes them feel. So maybe Instagram right before bed at night typically makes them feel anxious, and a podcast in the morning generally helps them feel informed. And TikTok at lunch is a nice distraction so long as they're only on it for a few minutes. Typically, this step results in a long list of habits that are accompanied with little smiley faces and frowny faces next to each one. And then we ask teens to choose. Now that you've taken stock of your digital habits, choose one habit that you want to change for yourself. This is so simple, but it fundamentally flips the script, since so often adults are just handing down tech rules that we think are a good idea with little attention to what's actually already going well or going terribly for a particular teen. It's also useful because teens choose things that we would have never thought to make rules about, and they get specific in ways we wouldn't have been able to. So sometimes, yes, they focus on something like cutting down TikTok use. That's been a big one lately. But they also choose to work on things like avoiding Snapchat community stories during homework time, or trying to balance or shift something very specific about their news consumption on a particular platform. Once they've chosen a habit, teens design personal challenges. And again, this language is really intentional. We found that reframing, so instead of saying a new rule, instead using the term a personal challenge, embeds the idea of agency and personal investment in their habit experiment. Maybe the challenge is to read online news from a different perspective, or to stop reaching for their phones while waiting in lines, or to sleep with devices in a different room. And if you've ever tried to change a well-entrenched habit for yourself, you probably know that one of the things that boosts success is to add friction to an unwanted habit, and to reduce friction to make a new habit easier. So if a teen wants to add friction that helps him change the habit of mindlessly browsing Facebook during the virtual school day, he might turn off Facebook notifications, log out of the app on his computer, keep his phone across the room, or even delete the app entirely so that it's less smooth to just log in. We also hear about teens using specific apps that block access to a certain platform for a certain amount of time as another way to try and support their self-regulation. In The Social Dilemma, we hear about the ways that technology companies are working to remove friction, but we can be really intentional about adding some back in. And then after teens design these challenges for themselves, they try them out and track their progress for a set limited period of time, typically just a week or two. They might need to adjust the challenge as they go if they found that it's much too hard or too easy. But the key is that we really want them to have a win, even if it's a really small one, because even more important than the specific habit they change is the opportunity to cultivate more active awareness, and then to see that changes are within reach. And we hear again and again from teens that more active awareness around tech use is transformative, whether it's recognizing the impact of notifications, or getting in the habit of pausing before they go on a certain app, assessing how do I feel right now, and is browsing likely to help or hurt. Social buy-in matters tremendously for teens too, and this gets into the social networks piece that you heard Dr. Child speaking about. So if they can take on a challenge as a friend group, it's all the more powerful. We just interviewed a teen whose friend group decided to make it a collective goal to support each other in navigating school responsibilities during the pandemic. And they realized that they were struggling with digital distractions. And their response was that they started doing evening study groups over video chat, where they work quietly. And the idea is that they don't let each other get distracted or check their phones, and they can see if someone is getting distracted or starts spending a lot of time on their phone. And I love this example because it challenges the idea that any tech use during homework time is necessarily a distraction. And this is just yet another reason why it's so valuable to start by listening to teens and to shift away from the assumption that any tech is an interference. So I want to be clear, now that I've given you some of these examples, that I'm definitely not suggesting that we solve the issues of persuasive technology just with education or with kids and teens trying to change their own behaviors. For one, I think that places way too much of the burden on youth. But I do think that it's worth looking for ways we can support agency and help teens move toward relationships with technology that they feel really good about. One final point for now, which is that kids and teens are so aware of what we model when it comes to tech. And adults often lament that teens are distracted by or glued to their devices, yet this is frequently exactly what we're modeling in our own tech use. So before we start to criticize, I think it's worth taking a moment to brainstorm, reflect on our own habits, and maybe even think about trialing our own personal challenges as part of this process. Thanks. I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Emily. That was wonderful. So, as the three of you were talking about this and making, presenting your arguments, I was thinking. So it seems so logical and rational that we are able to articulate that the focus of social dilemma is very negative, and there's a lot that is missing there, Yet, if you watch the documentary itself, it is so powerful. So I want to start there, but I want to ask a question about social dilemma, but I have a few questions, using that as a starting point for some of the issues you raised. So what did the documentary get wrong? And what did it get right? If any of the panelists can jump in, or I can call on you. So. Stephanie, you want to jump in first? You're on mute.
Okay, great. So, yeah, I think certainly there were a lot of things. Both good and bad things about the documentary. Obviously, this is a very sensationalized documentary that sat there and told us, how manipulative tech was. And I watched it with captions on, so it was great when the captions were like eerie music playing, and it's a drama, right? And I was actually reading in the comments right now, and Ms. Bean brought up a really interesting point, which is we're having all of this media and these documentaries that tell us how awful tech is. It's going to manipulate researchers, potentially into only looking at the negative effects of social media, right? So I think that's a really interesting point. So I think part of the thing that they got wrong was they only focused on the negative, right? They're causing this sense of panic, and what do we do and how do we respond, and how do we quickly respond, right? And I don't think that there is a quick fix or a quick solution to this. Certainly also, I think, speaking to the fact that I was at Facebook in 2018, a lot of these folks that they were interviewed, they worked in Facebook and they worked in Google in 2010. And truly that is a generation or a full lifetime ago in terms of tech and the way that they are thinking about these things. And so certainly their perspective on things is a decade old now, and a lot has changed. I will tell you, first and foremost, being there in 2018, a lot has changed from what they were telling us. And so these companies are actually very reactive. They don't like receiving criticism in the media. I think that that's a very powerful tool that we can continue to use, is to use the platforms and criticize them. I think that's something that the documentary got right. And they are very receptive to their users, right? The other thing that they got right is the users are the product. And if we are unhappy with how we are being, used, essentially, they will respond. They have started responding. One of the other things that I think that they focused on just very, very briefly, but I think it's an extremely important topic, again, is that you have 25-year-old white males making these, decisions that are going to affect a very diverse population. And so I alluded to this in my goals or things that I'd like to see moving forward, but not only a more diverse workforce within tech, but also, hearing from diverse users. And so at least when I was at Facebook, they were very disinterested in looking at specific demographics. But we know that how users are affected depends on your age. It differs depending on your gender, your race or your ethnicity or what country you're from. And so encouraging them to think more about how specific demographic groups are affected by their use, I think, is really important moving forward. So, and I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Jeff, you want to weigh?
Oh, sure. I thought the question also in the chat was very instructive here, and this issue of a moral panic. I think that the entire introduction of Dr. Child pointed out, people were worried about whether or not, telephones in your house were going to cause social collapse. Like it was a big deal. And that of course happened in my generation with playing video games. So there's always tends to be a technology related concern. And I would add, I think specifically is, the problem in part is that researchers are going to research the things that they are able to research based on the funding sources and the kinds of questions that get reinforced. And oftentimes problem-based research is really where it's at. So if you look up, for example, social media addiction, the number of articles is huge. But if you look up research that's like positive uses of social media, I mean, I'm not really sure there's a lot of them out there. So as a consequence, I think we don't know much about the question, in part because that we don't have any research evidence to support it. But specific to your question, Vish, one of the things that I think that the film did do a nice job of is it talked about how decisions that were made by tech companies while they were developing these things shaped their goals about the user experience. And I think that that is actually really useful because a lot of people think of media as being kind of a, you don't understand the behind the scenes working of it. And I thought that it was instructive. And for folks who didn't know anything about media, how media companies make decisions or social media companies make decisions, it was useful because I think a lot of people just don't know. I thought that the worst part about the film was the idea that there was basically, everyone was in a state of like upset and crisis, like all of the time. Like the family dinner was, destroyed. This young man, and he tried to quit, has like a girl who's falling in love with, who's the tech company is manipulating him with that information. So he gets back on. I'm like, boy, this is really mean-spirited stuff. And that doesn't even touch the stuff about politics and otherwise. So I think that what's unfortunate about that is that if you want doom and gloom, there are lots of messages out there you can get for that. As I said, research would support it in some level too, because again, addiction-based research gets funded, positive pro-social use research doesn't.
Thank you, Jeff. I know Emily, I already began talking about it. Do you want to make an additional points on what we missed or what the documentary missed, Emily?
Sure, I can be quick. I think, well, I spoke about what I think it missed to some extent. I think some of the best parts are, I really appreciate the emphasis on directing the public's attention to how intentional some of the design choices and features are, and also to what's completely unintentional. I think it's really helpful and empowering to recognize the decision-making process behind some of these tools and features that we see. It's not an accident that the notification flag is red instead of blue. That's an example I've heard Tristan and his colleagues use because the red flag is more annoying. So you want to get it off your screen, so you're more likely to click on it. And that's a product of the A/B testing that they were talking about. So I think that just overall, the idea of directing the public attention and conversation to some of these features and to the importance of design is really useful. I think I have to agree with Dr. Hall. I think the worst part is that it's pretty anxiety inducing. I think Dr. Child said that too. I was rewatching the film last night because I was obviously updating some notes for today, and I couldn't even get anyone in my house to watch it with me because everyone was like, "Oh, I can't go into that headspace right now. That was just so depressing." And I think that's really a shame and a problem in some ways because not only does it sort of redirect our research toward the negative, as Dr. Hall mentioned, but I have found that this is such an interesting area to do research in. I will be at a social gathering completely out of the academic sphere, or even in the academic sphere in a different discipline. And I'll be with a colleague who is asked what they study, and someone will just say, "Oh, what do you study?" And they'll respond. And then people will say, "Oh, what are you learning? What are you finding?" And my experience has never been that. I say that I study teens and technology, and then no matter who I'm talking to, they want to tell me exactly what they know we must be finding and that they know how bad it is. And this is such a puzzle because you heard a review from Dr. Hall of the research, and that is just not the clear narrative that's come out of the last 5 to 10 years of research. And so I think we really do have this sort of disconnect between what the data are really showing and what the public assumes to be true and assumes to be horrible about this context. And we see some ways that I think that the film really leans into that narrative rather than doing much to counterbalance it.
So let me push you all a little bit on that, somewhat like the street lamp effect, and I'll come back in a second to talk about that, right? So Dr. Bekalu asked this question about moral panic. So any historian of media effects will start talking about the pain fund studies, where when the movies were studied and the impact of movies, right, the Nickelodeons was studied, people thought the Nickelodeons were actually engendering a generation of deviants, social deviants, who were skipping school. They were good. These were truants who were going out and shoplifting and doing all kinds of bad things. And of course, the famous sociologists, Bloomer and others, actually went in and started looking at the data and came out with the same finding that Emily has come out maybe almost 100 years later, which is these are differential effects. Not all kids who are going to Nickelodeons are actually becoming truants. There are, a small group of them who already are predisposed to have these problems and are being affected by these films differently. And everything after that, right? Radio, right? And the War of the Words, the famous study, again, the same impact. You go back to, of course, television. There were 2 congressional committees on the impact of television. Even comics, right? The Seduction of the Innocent was the title of the book, because the comics were supposed to, seducing these innocent kids and teenagers into doing deviant things. So we always had this notion of a negative impact. And I want to ask you this question. It's like that very famous cliched story about a drunk who's trying to find the keys he lost, and he goes and looks for the keys under the street lamp, because that's where the light is. Why are we missing the boat? Why are we not looking at the positive effects of social media, just as we have not done with the television? For example, television was used for education, distance education, very successfully. So I'm just curious, why are we missing that point? What is it that we are doing wrong, that we are not documenting the positive effects or well-being effects of social media? Emily, go ahead.
Well, I think to some extent, I think that some researchers are, and certainly I've tried in my work, and I think we do see that there are really positive effects on, or there can be positive effects on things like a sense of social connection and on opportunities for self-expression. There's a whole body of research on online fan fiction and how powerful that's been for the development of writing skills. We see that teens are pursuing hobbies in really new and powerful ways. There are opportunities for learning and supporting learning networks, informal learning networks. If you think about your professional networks, teens are leveraging those. And I think that for sure, even I'm thinking, I worked with some colleagues on a study that is about to be published that was interviewing adolescents in a psychiatric inpatient unit. And all of the adolescents had been actively suicidal within the last week. So this was a really high-risk population. And we were focused on trying to understand their perspectives on social media. And even in that population of young people who were all really in the midst of a psychiatric crisis, we saw that there were, for some of them, that there were real important and meaningful positives that were supporting hope and recovery and coping. And I think sometimes when we look just at big data and when we're looking just for these sort of population effects, which has been a bias, we can miss out on some of the details that can be really profoundly positive. And even really positive for the kids who are most at risk. So it's not even the case that every orchid, that everyone who's in the orchid category is suddenly having a negative experience. I think we have to ask what is being mirrored from offline life and amplified, and then we can start to see some of those differences.
So maybe I should have said, with the exception of the panelists here when I asked that question, but as Jeff said, Jeff, and please feel free to jump in response to my question. You put social media and addiction, social media and isolation, you get a ton of studies on PubMed and other places, but the functional outcomes, or the positive effects or positive well-being do not, so there's something, the way we are focusing too, right, as researchers and failing to document it. And that's why I'm so curious if you want to correct that. Jeff?
Yeah, what I would also say that I'd love to hear Dr. Child's thoughts about this, because she studies social networks maybe in a way different than my own. But when I tend to think of social networks, I think of it very similar to the idea of you have a small group of very important others, and then that's only extended out to a slightly larger group of pretty important others. And then after that, it's a whole bunch of acquaintances and strangers. Like, it's really not a very big group. If you look at mobile phone data in terms of voice calls, the network is only about 3 to 5 people large. Texting, between 7 and 14 persons large. And the people you actually interact with on social media, it's not really big either. So if you think about it, what's happening here is this effect of social networks on people's behavior is mirroring offline life. It's very, very unlikely that you have people who are in that top network of individuals who are on social media, but you never talk to any other place. Like it's not like they only exist there, but you would be astonished to see how much research doesn't even bother to find out what is your relationship with the people you're communicating with on social media. So what's odd about that to me is that that obscures effects that might be happening because of the offline relationship, or the relationship built through the cell phone, or built through whatever other ways of communicating that are not social media. The other, I think, important issue that I might add to your question is that I think that part of what's difficult here, and I really like Dr. Weinstein's comments, the effects are probably so dependent on what's going on in that individual's lives that to blur them with just big claims misses the point. I'll give you 2 anecdotes. One is that there's a really good evidence that if you have an online support group for all kinds of issues, for individuals who particularly have no access to other people who could have that condition or are otherwise immobile, they can't leave their homes. We all can't leave our homes right now, but I mean people genuinely who need access to others. The benefits of being able to interact with other people through media are strengthen the interventions to try to improve people's health. So what's interesting about this is that if we forget the idea that people benefit from media, then we just want to paint it as the broad brush as being bad. The other is, I think, important to also to point out is that for people who are particularly sexual minorities or individuals who have a very small network of others who are going through similar experiences, it really helps to have someone who understands. It really helps to have someone out there, and there may be nobody in their community. So we can't forget the idea that the breadth of media allows for people to get in contact with people who can be supportive, loving, and concerned in ways that we wouldn't know otherwise.
Great, thank you. Stephanie, did you want to jump in? Or?
Yeah, no, we are working, Jeff, you'll be delighted, we are working on a paper that examines exactly what you were just talking about in the first half of your comments. So Claude Fisher and I have a communication paper under review right now where you look at modes of communication and we compare face-to-face with online interactions. And truly, what the pundits will tell you is that there's this replacement, right? That all of the people that we communicate with are being replaced by these shallow online ties that we don't know, we really don't know who they are. And the data just don't support that. The data actually support that it's the same individuals that we're communicating with face-to-face that we are also communicating with most online. And so it's not a replacement, it's just that we are communicating now more than ever, right? So it used to be that we would go to work and we wouldn't see that person for the entire day, and now we're communicating with them throughout the day. We're sharing memes, we're doing all sorts of things online. And so, the amount of communication and information that's being passed is exponential. I will kind of bring, to your point about, why are we just focusing on the negative? I think we just have to bring it back to the fact that a lot of these are businesses and they have liabilities to cover, right? And I think that's just, gets to the point of all of it is they want to cover all their bases, and so they want to focus on mitigating kind of the bad aspects and the bad actors, right? And we're certainly seeing that. So from a legal and a business standpoint, they're going to focus on the negatives. But from a research standpoint, I would absolutely love it if we would focus more on all of the positive aspects. I can go on for days about all of the anecdotal evidence that I saw when I was at Facebook, and I'm sure other tech companies will say the same thing. The amount of good social and economic consequences that are coming from these platforms has been tremendous. As an example, the amount of fundraising dollars that go, that that come from kind of your birthday fundraiser at, that Facebook champions now. I mean, we're talking millions of dollars that are going into great foundations. So that's just one example. But certainly we would love to see, and like I mentioned, Facebook does have a growing team of researchers who are very similar to myself, have either a psychology or a sociology background, who are very interested in making sure that their users are happy and healthy. Again, we are their product. They don't want to see us depressed and anxious, just like we don't want to see ourselves depressed and anxious. They do want us to be healthy and happy and coming back to the platform. They do want us to feel satisfied with their product. And a lot of that is derived from how you feel after using their product. So, so I think that ultimately our end goal, but also their end goal is to have happy and satisfied users.
Right, thank you. So there are a couple of questions on data, I think, in two different ways. I think one is, who controls the data, right? I mean, so basically data are currency, right? Here. So, and the companies will be virtually non-existent if there are no data they can collect, right? Or use those data. And Europe has taken some very interesting steps towards that, through GDPR, etc. So, so one of the questions that has come up on the chat is, how do we, a number of people have proposed, including Dr. Tim Berners-Lee and others, about really restricting the social media platforms to use the data they wanted to use, and so what do you think about it? Is that one way to get the platforms to change their behavior, given that sometimes they had to be drawn in kicking and screaming to make any changes? So, what do you think?
I mean, the data are proprietary, and that is their business model. It is something that I shouldn't say willingly, but we agree. They are private businesses. I would be interested in seeing what a model might look like if that data were to become either I don't know, housed by the government or publicly available. But yes, as you mentioned, a lot of these companies, even though they're based here in America, they do have to comply with GDPR and a lot of the rules that are, so we've already seen quite of a big shift in those operations. So I'll stop there.
And do you know if that has changed the way they operate and use some of these tools in Europe?
Yes, very much so. So it's it doesn't really, at least from a business perspective, it doesn't. It behooves them to just play it safe. And so because the EU has enacted GDPR, everything is compliant with GDPR, and so those changes are also taking place for users here in America as well. Mm-hmm. It's truly a global business.
Jeff, Emily, do you want to say anything on that?
That's outside my range of expertise.
Let me, there's another question which is interesting on the data that came up, which asks, how does access to social network data affect what researchers can say about the effect of online social networks on human behavior? Given that, for all of us, unless you are a consultant with Facebook, whatever data we collect on social networks is from outside the social networks. So how does, do you think if we have better access, our questions will change, and will we do things differently?
I mean, absolutely. But it's also not, how do I explain this? I don't know that it's in these companies' interests to allow those things to occur from an independent point of view, right? I would expect that it would be very hard for them to say, here's access to our data, ask the questions you like and publish what you will. I just don't see that happening. On the other hand, I would say that the kind of information you get is amazing. There are 2 articles, one done by Rich Ling in Norway, and then another one done in England by a researcher I can't quite recall at this moment. But it looked at patterns of text message exchange, patterns of basically behavior that was done through cell phone companies. When they opened it up, some amazing kind of things about the size of people's networks and who they communicate with and how frequently they do so emerged. And frankly, that descriptive information is so valuable, but that's rare. Like, as a person who consumes this literature with abandon, I just don't see a lot of articles written by independent researchers having access to social media companies' data that are just like, sure, go ahead and do that.
Mm-hmm. Emily?
I think we also need to be really sensitive to the ways that data can be misused, and to the ways that people who are already in positions of vulnerability might be targeted and have their data used in ways that would not, I think, not sit well with many or most of us, I hope. I'm thinking actually of an example of something that Desmond Patton and his research team have written about around the idea of social media policing and the ways that and this is not looking at the network's data as much, but to some extent that as well, the way that police departments in some places have started leveraging social media posts and even connections in not only in reactive ways, but in what are considered proactive ways of trying to prevent crime. But the problem is that, of course, the same biases that often are baked into policing that can happen in person are happening with and through social media. And that is even more so the case when we think about posts that are taken completely out of context and seen by audiences that they weren't meant for and misinterpreted, and whether it's rap lyrics being completely misunderstood or misinterpreted and then suddenly being used as evidence against someone for a violent tendency. These aren't just anecdotes. These are real patterns and risks that we're seeing as we think about ways that these data are used. And so that's a consideration that feels really important to have in the conversation as well.
It's interesting you raised that issue. I don't know how many of you are now on Twitter with a recent request by FBI to identify the rioters who entered the Capitol Hill. So if you go and take a look at that site, a lot of the so-called policing is volunteer. I mean, it's incredible, mind-boggling how people are actually tracking and identifying. These are pure volunteers. This is what they do, spend a few hours and identifying who was in the Capitol Hill through social media use. It's like a rabbit hole, as I say, so there are, of course, functions and dysfunctions to it. I have a couple of other questions that have come up. One, I think, is asking in general about the importance of algorithms and how that influences what the kind of information we receive and the awareness we should have about algorithms. I think this specific question asks about how do we not get influenced by our term searches on Google if the level of information itself being given to us is dependent on an amalgamation of who we are. And I'm just wondering if you want to respond to that. And it raises this larger question of our interaction with these media, consciously or unconsciously. So, Stephanie, go ahead.
Yeah, I get frustrated with that as well. I know, at least when I'm on Twitter, there'll be 4,000 comments, and the top 10 comments that I see are things that would agree with my with my own set of beliefs, and I'm constantly looking through to see who's got a difference of opinion. I think there's a lot of things to be said around this. Certainly, by far and away, I think Facebook or other platforms do expose us to a more diverse set of content than we might otherwise see. But certainly, it is very frustrating. When you're on Google and, I think the example in the video is you start typing in a phrase and it will kind of complete it for you. So certainly that is very frustrating. I know I often go on and will kind of clear my cache or clear my settings as often as possible to try to get outside of that bubble. But those things happen again offline as well. And, you know, I would encourage you to strike up conversations and strike up relationships with individuals who have a difference of opinion than you do. I've also been reading a little bit recently about some experiments where they decided to purposely expose you to things that were different than you. And actually, rather than opening or shifting your opinion or opening your mind, it actually solidified your opinion, and it caused you to dig in your heels a little bit more in your original belief. And so we say that we want a difference of opinion, and both, you know, the data and anecdotally, it bears out that we actually do not. So I don't know what to kind of say about that, other than, you know, to, as individuals, try to cultivate and be kind of proactive in cultivating relationships with people with differences of opinion.
Thank you, Stephanie. We are running out of time. We can stay for the rest of the evening. So I'll ask one question. If they have a time, I want closing remarks, and if you have the time after that. Are we ideologically biased by ignoring hedonic well-being, you know, the value of entertainment? You know, for example, somebody like me who grew up 8,000 miles from here, I have this wonderful connection with friends I have not seen in ages, my childhood classmates, and we have great fun exchanging messages and exchanging videos, jokes, etc. A lot of value in terms of, you know, building that relationship, cultivating that relationship, you know, the kind of a hedonic nature of it. And you know, are we, you know, so ideologically biased that we are ignoring all that value of positive well-being? You know, so.
You mean ideologically biased, like we can't enjoy people's company because of politics, or I don't quite follow. I'm sorry.
So are we just focusing on bad and without bad? Because we always, you know, felt like we should all read the New Yorker and ignore television, right?
Well, I might mention two things. There's a huge number of people who don't vote, don't care about politics, don't read books, don't do stuff, but they still love spending time with their friends. They still consume media. They're still engaged with one another. And there's a lot to say that human connection tends to be across time, across continent, across people. People love to feel connected. And the jokes that you share with your friends, whether they're emoji or memes or whatever, those things bond one another. Mm-hmm. And I would say that, you know, as a concluding remarks for this panel, we want to help people build practices that build each other up, that show support, that show concern, that show fun, you know, that through all of these practices with people who matter to us, people build friendships, and it takes time to build friends. And you can do that through media and through face-to-face and both. So I would hope that we are not so ideologically biased as human beings that we can't, you know, still have a great time. But I would say there's a lot of people who are probably having a grand time and not terribly worried about things in just a more narrow sense. But anyway, yeah, I think human connection is fantastic, and I think that kind of that part that you're bringing attention to is the way forward.
Thank you. I was thinking of the ideological bias of academics, and I'll always focus on this side. So, Stephanie, Emily, do you want to say anything? We just have about a minute. Quick concluding remarks. You know, so, Emily.
Thank you for being with us tonight. I think a major takeaway of the film is just that our attention is such a precious commodity, and where and how we choose to direct it really matters. And so I appreciate clearly the gift of your attention and engagement tonight. And I think that the simplest intervention that we can all do is to give that attention in a focused way to others. It doesn't mean that technology is not part of that. Maybe you're doing it in a focused FaceTime call. But to really have a little more mindfulness as we go about the rest of our weeks around how we're choosing to spend our attention, how we're modeling that for other people, and how technology is fitting into that relationship.
Thank you, Emily. Stephanie, you get the last word.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate everyone being here tonight. I think this is certainly a useful and engaging conversation to have. I hope that we continue to think about it and continue to have conversations around our social engagement. I think at the end of the day, we all need to be open to ideas, treat other individuals as they would like to be treated, and understand that, our social relationships are truly at the end of the day we have. And so I think we need to really nurture them. And social media can be a tool for that. So thank you all again for joining us tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie. So let me thank Jeff, Stephanie, and Emily for participating in the panel. Really appreciate it. Hopefully this is a starting point of a conversation and not the end of it. So I'm sure we'll hear more about this. I also want to thank the audience for signing on at this late evening. Hopefully it was worth it. And I also want to thank again Jamie and Melia for organizing this and arranging this behind the scenes. So on behalf of Lara and myself, thanks everyone. It was a wonderful panel and it was very illuminating and instructive. Thank you so much. Lara, any final words? You want to give the royal wave?
I was just going to say thank you to everybody and especially to our panelists, because I do think that the perspectives shared here are definitely not the typical perspectives that people are hearing. So hopefully broadening our perspectives on the uses and misuses of social media is enormously valuable, because of course with greater understanding we'll be able to harness it better, hopefully for better health. So thank you all so much, and thanks to everyone who joined us for their really excellent questions and thoughts. And I just wish we had 6 more hours to discuss it, but we'll figure out a way at the center to continue the conversation in some way. And if that's of interest to you, please feel free to let us know, and we'll keep it in mind.
We'll
Thank you all.
continue the conversation. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks everyone. Have a good night. Stay safe.